And I think one of the really incredible things about this book is not only does it tell your story, but it sort of tells the story of Atlanta itself and the history of Black communities there and the multiple assaults they've faced, the social, economic, political, all these different forces at play here. So I just wanted to step back before we get into the trial and the investigations and how this all proceeded. Talk a little bit about the where this all unfolded, because this also happened. The cheating was alleged, right? Because the cheating said they found huge increase in test scores. So those were at schools that were some of the schools with the highest levels of poverty in a lot of the neighborhoods, as you talked about, that are in the process of being displaced or neighborhoods are being relocated. Can we sort of just step back and talk about that history?
Well, in the original GBI report, the investigative report, there were 44 schools that were implicated in this scandal. 11 of those schools are where teachers and administrators were actually pulled from to later go on the RICO indictment. And if you look at those communities of where those schools are, many of them were in thriving Black communities in the 1940s and 50s, which is why the book is so important, so we can take a step and look at how these communities were systematically dismantled. But there were several Black-owned businesses. It was safe. People rarely locked their doors. But as more Black people started moving to the city, more white people started moving to the suburbs, it yielded this greater Black political power. And this was something that was concerning to white business elite. So they come up with this plan called the Lochner Plan, which was basically a plan for highway construction to rip right through many of these thriving Black communities. And there were hundreds of homes that were taken through eminent domain. Thousands of people were displaced from their homes. And this is just the beginning of the dismantling of those communities. You have the drug wars, you have mass incarceration. There was a veteran teacher who told me that before the crack epidemic, the children came to school prepared. The parents wanted to be involved in their children's education so much that they had to put the parents on a waiting list because they just wanted to be involved. And everything changed after that. And so, it was really disheartening that during the trial and as far as some of the media coverage, it seemed as if educators were being blamed for just how students were cheated. And, they were cheated in so many different ways. And to put all of the blame on educators, we were really scapegoated at the end of the day.
And the book also talks about how the Atlanta public school system was also giving subsidies to real estate developers while this was all happening. So I'm talking about hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars of education money going to developers, and how that helped sort of fuel this crisis as well. Amidst, while this was happening, there was also cutbacks to the schools as well from the governor. Can you talk about that a little bit as well?
Yeah, so Atlanta has something called tax allocation districts, and this is something that other cities have as well. It's in many places called tax increment financing, or TIF.
Yeah, we have that here.
Right. So, yeah, it's worth looking into because that money is property tax dollars that are supposed to go to the city, the county, and the school system, and instead they go into a slush fund for private development. So in Atlanta, the school system has missed out on $434 million since the year 2000 to pay for things like a project called the Beltline that is a rails to trails project. It's called a glorified sidewalk sometimes. But it's one of the largest drivers of gentrification. The hype around, the Beltline is coming to this neighborhood has really been a huge factor in driving up the property values in historically Black neighborhoods and displacing the very children, right, that those funds are intended to educate. It's been used to build luxury condos and boutique retail and office development. Hard Rock hotels were in the works up until a point when it was actually challenged in court, and the Georgia Supreme Court said, it's unconstitutional to use education funds for anything that's not related to education. But our lawmakers turned around, introduced a resolution to put an amendment, a constitutional amendment on the ballot, which voters passed because a lot of interests, including real estate developers, donated money to a campaign to support this measure, sort of putting a lot of flowery language around it about how it will help bring together education and positive development and things like that. So the actual state constitution was amended to allow these education funds to be continually used for gentrification, essentially.
And so Judge Baxter called the cheating scandal the sickest thing that's ever happened to this town. Your response to that?
Again, I think that it goes back to people wanting to scapegoat educators. I thought his comment was ridiculous. He apparently forgot about things like slavery and Jim Crow. And, you know, even his behavior during the trial, it was unlike anything I'd ever seen. And I don't know if you want to get into some of the things that happened.
Absolutely. You talk in the book. You talk about how the media paid little attention to the numerous times the case was almost dismissed. Repeated calls for mistrial, examples of prosecutorial misconduct, witnesses who perjured themselves. You get lots of examples of that in the book, and some who recanted while on the stand. There were state's witnesses who, on the stand, you know, sort of said, I said this under pressure to get this plea deal. So talk about Judge Baxter, who played prominently in this case.
Right. So we were facing decades in prison. I was facing 25 years. Some of my co-defendants were facing up to 40 years in prison. And initially, when we turned ourselves in, my bond was set at $200,000. There were other, some of my co-defendants' bonds were in the millions. And so we couldn't even afford, you know, to bail out. And so pretty much what they did was they said, okay, we'll lower your bonds as long as you can be placed under a gag order. And so after the gag order was lifted, the judge suggested that we still not speak to the media. So we never really got a chance to tell our side of the story. But during the trial, he had a private conversation with the district attorney.
Which is not supposed to happen.
No, that's not supposed to happen. And the district attorney, by the way, his wife worked at a school where cheating occurred, but she was never indicted. No one from her school was ever indicted. It was really a conflict of interest for him to prosecute this case. But the judge had a private conversation with the district attorney. Of course, our attorneys asked for a mistrial, and he said no. And then there was a situation where he actually tried to assist a state witness with identifying one of my co-defendants who was told that she could step down from the witness stand and walk around the courtroom to see if she could identify my co-defendant named Tamara Cotman. And so the woman gets down and starts walking around, and the judge calls out to her and says, "You're getting cold." So the woman turns around and starts walking in the opposite direction. She never recognized Ms. Cotman and eventually returned to the witness stand. And of course, the defense attorneys said, "Judge, you can't do that." He said, "Seriously, she is cold." So we had to deal with things like that. Later, after we were convicted, because there were 12 of us on trial, 11 of us were convicted, and the judge tried to bully my co-defendants into taking the district attorney's sentencing agreement, which included giving up their constitutional right to appeal. Initially, the judge said that he would grant a first offender status and an appeal bond. But once he learned that many of my co-defendants were basically saying, "No, we're not going to take that," he took it back. And he said, "Well, I'm not granting an appeal bond or first offender status." And the defense attorney said, "But Judge, you've already promised him this." He said, "Well, I guess I'm just an Indian giver." So these were the types of things that we had to deal with during the trial.
And altogether, I think the cumulative effect of that was to just totally demean and diminish the defendants in the eyes of the jury. His behavior every day was sort of full of these kind of antics, and reported on in the media with this kind of glee around his like buffoonery, as if it was, you know, part of the spectacle and kind of funny to everybody. But it was no laughing matter. I mean, with people facing decades in prison.
And there was also prosecutorial conduct. The lead prosecutor, her name was Fonnie Willis. She was caught making like facial expressions to the jury and to some of the state witnesses. And people kept telling the judge, "Hey, we see her making these facial expressions." And he said, well, I didn't see anything. But finally, towards the end of trial, he actually caught her and he said, "Miss Willis, you need to stop making facial expressions toward the jury." And we're thinking, how long has this been going on? So there was a lot of judicial misconduct, prosecutorial misconduct that took place in this trial.
And so you're currently appealing your conviction. That's finally moving forward from what I understand.
Yeah.
2 other defendants' appeals were just denied. Can you talk about what happened?
Right. They appealed the case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, but unfortunately, the U.S. Supreme Court did not hear the case. And so these 2 co-defendants had to turn themselves in to prison in October. So they've been in prison since October. And, they have children. One of them has, I think he's about 14 years old, a middle schooler. And so this is just really, I can just imagine what he's going through not having his mother at home at such an impressionable time. But those 2 co-defendants kind of handled the appeal in a different way. So we're still hoping, there's 7 of us that are still appealing. So we're hoping that, well, number one, we can get the judge off of this case.
And so far, you've been unsuccessful.
Yes. Our attorneys have asked him to recuse himself. He refuses. He actually retired, and they reassigned our case to another judge, but somehow the same judge has been allowed to remain on our case. We have no idea how this is happening. So yeah, they've even taken the issue to the Georgia Court of Appeals. So far, they have done nothing. So we're just hopeful that at some point, someone will take a hard look at what actually happened and take it seriously, because so many things were done incorrectly in this case. And so he can't be impartial. Right before the verdict was released, he told the jury, "Whatever your verdict is, I will defend it until I die." So it's hard to believe that he can continue to be impartial.
And then he was in the jury room as well?
He made a comment. It was a strange comment during the trial. I can't remember which defense attorney said this, but I think he said something to the effect of, well, this is the judge speaking, something to the effect of his client, Ms. Cotman, she had a speedy trial. Maybe it was a couple of years before our trial, but they were saying, well, the jury said that if cheating was the issue, they would have come back with a guilty verdict because she was found not guilty.
Which is a whole other issue, because she shouldn't have been in this the RICO trial, because she was actually found, she was acquitted on the underlying charge that RICO is then applied on top of. So it's essentially double jeopardy. And that was why her lawyer was bringing this up with the judge. But he said, no, in that case, the jury said such and such. When I was in the jury room.
And we were thinking, like, what are you talking about? Was he really back there? Was he just making this up? But he made that comment and said, well, they said it in the jury room. So we're just thinking, this has just gone too far,